Let's take a trip back in time and talk about how Cadillac became such a famous American car brand. When you hear the name Cadillac, you probably think of fancy cars, cool designs, and American pride. It's one of the oldest car brands in the US and has made a big impact on the car world. From starting small to becoming a symbol of luxury, Cadillac's story is all about creativity, hard work, and always trying to be the best. Cadillac started way back on August 22nd, 1902, thanks to an engineer named Henry Leland. He built the company using parts of an old car business called the Henry Ford Company. Leland decided to name it after the founder of Detroit, a French guy named Antoine de la Motte Cadillac. Even the famous Cadillac logo comes from the Cadillac family's coat of arms. The logo has a crown on top and some little birds called merlets. Even though the logo has changed over the years, it still stands for Cadillac today. The first Cadillac came out in 1903 and was a small two-seater car called the Model A. By 1904, Cadillac made over 2,500 cars, which was a really big deal back then. From 1904 to 1915, Cadillac sold a ton of cars and was one of the most popular brands. What made Cadillac special was how they focused on making high-quality cars. In 1908, they even won an award called the Dewar Trophy because their car parts were made so well they could be swapped out easily. In 1909, a young car company named General Motors bought Cadillac for $4.5 million. Even after that, Cadillac kept proving they were some of the best cars around. Back in 1912, two guys named Leland and Charles F. Kettering came up with the first car that could start on its own with an electric starter. It even had cool new lights. This was such a big deal that Cadillac won their second Dewar Trophy, making them the only car company to win it twice. A couple of years later, in 1914, Cadillac switched their logo to a fancy cursive style instead of the usual crest and wreath. This logo didn't last long and got swapped out for a new crest and wreath in 1915. That same year, every Cadillac car came with the first ever mass-produced V8 water-cooled engine. This was a big deal and helped shape how cars are made today. Not long after, in 1917, Leland left General Motors and started Lincoln Motor Company. Leland started Cadillac and turned it into a brand known for great quality and cool new ideas. In the 1920s, Cadillac entered a new era. Cars were becoming a normal part of life, so Cadillac found fresh ways to make their cars special and different from the rest. Back in 1925, Cadillac started using a special kind of paint that made their cars look amazing. By 1926, people could pick from over 500 color combos. Pretty cool, right? That same year, Cadillac changed their logo by taking off the wreath. They kept just the crest for a long time, until they brought the wreath back in 1963 on the Eldorado. A big moment for Cadillac happened back in 1927. In 1926, General Motors told Harley Earl to create the 1927 LaSalle convertible coupe. This was the first time in America that a car was designed by a designer instead of an engineer. Earl's work made Cadillac a name everyone knew for luxury and quality. In 1930, Cadillac was the first to put a V16 engine in a passenger car. Not long after, they also made V12 and V8 models. By the mid-1930s, Cadillac had over 68 different car styles, so people could pick and choose to make their cars stand out. Back in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Al Capone, a famous gangster, had two Cadillacs that were pretty wild. He tricked them out with bulletproof glass and even a police siren. Later on, in 1939, Cadillac added a big V under their logo. The V stuck around for most of the 1940s and 1950s, but it disappeared in the 1960s. Back in the early 1940s, Cadillac was all about making fancy cars, like the 1940 Fleetwood you see in The Godfather. But when World War II started, Cadillac stopped making cars and helped out with the war instead. They used their materials to build engines for airplanes. After the war, Cadillac got back to making cool cars and even came up with the famous tail fin design thanks to a guy named Harley Earl. The tail fin changed how cars looked for years, especially in the 1950s. Cadillac was super creative with both how their cars worked and looked, and they won the very first Car of the Year award in 1949. It's clear Cadillac helped shape cars in America and kept its place as one of the best car brands in the world. Back in the early 1950s, Cadillac made twice as many cars as they did in the 1940s. They were ahead of the game, adding cool things like power steering and new safety features. But the biggest wow factor? The super stylish Eldorado convertible coupe. The Eldorado had huge tail fins that made it look super fancy, showing off how cool it was to own a Cadillac. Cadillac became known as a rich and stylish car, even showing up in pop culture. Remember Elvis Presley's famous pink Cadillac from 1955? Or the movie The Solid Gold Cadillac? Cadillac wasn't just a big deal on the road, it was a hit in movies and with celebrities too. Back in the 1960s, Cadillac brought in some cool new ideas to make cars safer and more comfy. They added seat belts, and pretty soon, it became a law to have them in cars. In 1964, they also came up with fancy stuff like headlights that turn on by themselves and a heating and air conditioning system you could control. A lot of changes happened back then, like when Cadillac got rid of its famous tail fins in 1965. In the 1970s, Cadillac started adding cool new stuff like computers and safety features to their cars. They were one of the first to use airbags in 1974, way before it became normal for all cars to have them. Back in 1975, Cadillac started using engines that worked with electronic fuel injection. Then, in 1978, they added a computer to their cars. In the 1980s, all cars, including Cadillacs, got a big makeover with a new look. They also brought back the wreath around the Cadillac logo for all their cars. Cadillac worked hard to make car delivery and talking to customers better, and it paid off. They got named #1 in customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. In the 80s, they did some cool tech stuff too, like being the first to use a microprocessor for fuel ignition and car diagnostics. Cadillac also stayed super popular in movies like Ghostbusters and The Blues Brothers, and in songs like Natalie Cole's Pink Cadillac. Cadillac was super popular in the 1970s, but things started going downhill in the 80s and 90s. Sales were at their best in 1978, but after that, they kept dropping. By the 1990s, things weren't looking so good. In 1997, Cadillac's sales fell behind Lincoln's for the first time ever. That got General Motors to step in and work on making Cadillac great again. They even updated the logo to look more like the one we see today. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Cadillac started changing its look to keep up with the times. That's when the Escalade came out, showing that Cadillac wanted to mix things up and stand out from other car makers. Even though the company had some struggles, it still kept its name as a brand known for luxury and comfort during the 90s. The worry was that younger people didn't think Cadillac was cool anymore. Instead, older people remembered it as a fancy car, like in the 90s TV show Seinfeld. What do you think? Trust me, I've been in a Cadillac hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Back in 2002, Cadillac celebrated its 100th birthday and kept working hard to make cool, innovative cars. Then, in 2003, they came out with the CTS, which was a big, bold step forward for the brand. They wanted to get younger people interested, so they even put their cars in the Matrix Reloaded. The 2003 CTS and the 2002 Escalade showed up in an epic car chase scene. How cool is that? The 2000s were a tough time for Cadillac. There were some wins, but also a lot of struggles. Even now, Cadillac is having a hard time keeping up with big luxury brands like BMW, Mercedes, and Lexus. In 2014, their sales dropped 6.5%. But General Motors is working hard to bring Cadillac back to its old glory with cool new designs, better technology, and fresh ideas for today's drivers. Cadillac wants to go out on its own and not be part of General Motors anymore. They're also trying to change up their look, and you can see it in the 2016 El Mirage concept car. The El Mirage has a fresh, modern logo and smooth, clean lines. It still has the fancy touches that people loved about old Cadillacs, but with a cool, new style. Cadillac is trying to be cool again, like when their Seal concept car showed up in the 2015 movie Entourage. Nobody really knows what's next for Cadillac, but it's still a big part of America's car history. People who remember Cadillac as the fancy car everyone wanted are hoping it can feel special again.